Judge thought the black girl before him was a student shocked to learn. She was an undercover FBI. The courtroom reeked of quiet cruelty, not the overt kind that shouts or strikes, but the kind that watches, judges, whispers behind closed doors, and smiles while it condemns you. Raina Monroe stood at the center of it all, a storm trapped in chains. Her hands were cuffed tightly in front of her, the steel cold against her skin, now bruised and raw. Blood dried at the edge of her mouth, a fading reminder of the violence she'd survived just 48 hours earlier. Her lip had split when Bryce Langston slammed her into the lockers, but no one cared about that. The only thing that mattered now was how she looked like a stereotype fulfilled. Young, black, cuffed. To them, that was all they needed to see. She stood tall before the judge's bench, head high, posture unbroken. Her silence wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was strategy. She refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her crack. The court was packed spectators, reporters, jurors. Eyes filled the room, but not a single one of them truly saw her. They saw a headline, a cautionary tale, a symbol of every lie the system told itself to sleep at night. Aggressive, dangerous, hostile. They didn't see the badge that had once sat over her heart. They didn't see the months she'd spent undercover, walking hallways thick with drugs, secrets, and predators in school uniforms. They didn't see the sacrifice. They didn't want to. Raina Monroe, the judge intoned, his voice mechanical, bored. You are charged with felony assault, battery, and unlawful possession of narcotics on school property. How do you plead? She didn't answer. Not yet. Across the room, Bryce Langston lounged behind his attorney, dressed in tailored gray, his golden hair slicked perfectly to the side. His left eye bore the faint yellow hue of healing bruises, a cosmetic inconvenience, a badge of manipulation. He didn't flinch under the room's scrutiny. Why would he? He knew the system belonged to him. Bryce's gaze locked on Raina's, and he smirked. A smirk that said, I've already won. It was the same expression he wore the night he cornered her, the same smug confidence that bled from his every word. You think they'll believe you? You're nobody. I'm a Langston. His father, Senator Charles Langston, sat behind him in the gallery, flanked by reporters and political advisors, his expression composed but watchful. He wore the mask of concerned parenthood, but the smug calculation behind his eyes couldn't be hidden from Raina. She'd seen that look before, from judges who dismissed abuse allegations, from officers who filed false reports, from men who thought their power was absolute. The prosecution leaned forward, his voice laced with theatrical concern. Members of the jury, what we have here is a young woman with a history of anger management issues, caught dealing drugs and attacking a peer in broad daylight. Mr. Langston, the victim in this case, has suffered not only physical harm, but irreparable psychological trauma. Trauma? Raina nearly laughed. The only trauma Bryce Langston had ever known was realizing someone had dared to fight back. No mention of the missing surveillance footage. No mention of the 3 girls who had filed complaints against Bryce and whose parents suddenly withdrew them from school without explanation. No mention of the whistleblower email Raina had sent to Internal Affairs, an email that had mysteriously disappeared from every server. Everything she'd built, everything she'd risked, erased by a single name. Langston. She shifted her weight slightly, testing the cuffs. Her jaw tightened, not from fear, but fury. Deep, molten fury. Not one person in that courtroom had asked why a top-tier student with no criminal record would suddenly snap. No one wondered why a girl with a perfect academic and community service profile would risk everything in a single senseless act of violence. They didn't care about the why. They only cared about the what. And what they saw was a black girl in chains. Her public defender cleared her throat, clearly overwhelmed, underprepared, and out of her depth. Your Honor, the defense would like to request a continuance to review new... Denied, the judge snapped. Proceed. Raina's heart pounded, not with panic, but with clarity. This trial was never about justice. It was about erasure. Bryce Langston was the son of a senator, a star athlete, a future politician, no doubt. He walked through life armored in privilege, and she was the perfect scapegoat, disposable, unimportant, convenient. But they'd made one mistake. They underestimated her. She was trained, she was watching, and she had not come unprepared. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the lie they were building so carefully was about to explode. As the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, Raina's eyes remained still, but her mind drifted, pulled violently into the past. Back to the day they found Simone's body, her sister. The last time Raina saw Simone alive, her sister had been laughing bright, carefree, radiant. It was a Sunday afternoon and they were sitting on the front porch drinking cheap lemonade and talking about the future. Simone had just gotten her acceptance letter to nursing school. She was finally getting out. A scholarship, a dorm room, a fresh start. Raina remembered the way her sister's smile lit up everything around her. 3 weeks later, she was gone. They said it was an overdose, a troubled youth who couldn't handle the pressure. A tragic but predictable outcome. No questions, no follow-ups. Just a sealed autopsy report and a shallow grave. But Raina knew her sister. Simone didn't touch drugs. She was focused, determined. The only thing she'd ever been addicted to was hope. So Raina dug deeper. She found Simone's journal buried beneath a pile of old clothes. Pages of names, locations, cryptic messages. Notes about a school program mentorship, networking, career building, all funded by the Langston Foundation. A gateway, Simone had called it. A door that led somewhere dark. The deeper Raina looked, the darker it got. Girls who went into the program came out different. Some disappeared, others dropped out. A few overdosed. All of them had one thing in common: Stonebridge Academy. So Raina made a decision, one that changed everything. She volunteered for a deep cover assignment. She shaved 2 years off her age, faked school records, changed her name. Raina Thomas, a quiet transfer student with a made-up past and a real vendetta. The first day she stepped into Stonebridge felt like walking into a dream or a trap. Gleaming floors, ivy-covered walls, gold-lettered banners celebrating excellence and tradition. But Raina saw through it all. This school was built on silence. Within a week, she started to see it. The way certain girls were pulled aside by guidance counselors. The way others suddenly had expensive clothes and new phones despite coming from nothing. Late-night parties, fake permission slips, teachers who forgot to mark students absent, in drugs, pills, powder, patches moving openly in bathrooms, in backpacks, even passed during class. She watched it all, documented everything. Her necklace was a mic. Her pen had a hidden camera. She recorded every deal, every whisper, every lie. But Stonebridge wasn't just infected, it was protected. No one questioned anything. The principal turned a blind eye. The dean of students, friendly, fatherly, redirected every complaint. And the other kids? They were either scared or complicit. The deeper she got, the more dangerous it became. And at the center of it all was Bryce Langston. He was charming, articulate, dangerous, his father's golden boy, captain of the lacrosse team, always smiling, always watching. He ran the operation like a CEO. He never touched anything directly, never left a digital footprint. He used other students' girls he'd seduced, boys he'd threatened. He moved product like clockwork, right under the administration's nose. And he saw Raina, almost immediately. "You don't belong here," he told her once casually, leaning against a locker with that perfect smile. "But I'm curious to see how long you'll last." It wasn't a flirtation, it was a warning. Raina kept her head down, kept gathering intel. But the pressure was mounting. Every day was a balancing act. One wrong move, one mistimed question, and it would all be over. She couldn't call for help, couldn't confide in anyone. Every teacher might be compromised. Every student might be watching her. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. Her cover was airtight, but her soul was unraveling. She'd walk the same halls her sister once did, wondering if Simone had felt the same fear, if she'd known how close danger was. And every time Raina passed the Langston Foundation office, the one with Simone's photo still hanging on the wall under the words, "In loving memory of a future healer," she clenched her fists and kept walking. They'd used Simone, branded her memory as a cautionary tale while covering up their crimes. Raina was running out of time. She needed one final piece of evidence. A direct link. A moment where Bryce slipped. But the deeper she went, the more isolated she became. And Bryce, he was starting to suspect her. The hallway was too quiet. It was late, well past school hours, and the glow of the emergency lights painted long shadows across the linoleum floors. Raina had just finished uploading the latest set of recordings to her encrypted drive. Whispers of deals made behind vending machines. The subtle handoff of pills in the girls' locker room. Another teacher turning a blind eye. She'd collected enough evidence to make someone nervous. Apparently, someone had noticed. She was halfway down the corridor when she felt it. That stillness. That unmistakable prickle at the back of her neck, the kind that warned you someone was behind you. Watching, waiting. Then the voice. Low, smooth, deadly. So, you've been busy. Raina turned slowly. Bryce Langston stood at the end of the hallway, his smile sharp, eyes gleaming with something far more dangerous than amusement. She said nothing. Her instincts screamed at her to stay calm, stay composed, but her heart was hammering now. He shouldn't have known. There was no way, unless someone had tipped him off. I always thought there was something off about you, he continued, stepping closer, hands casually in his pockets. Too smart, too quiet, too interested. She backed up inch by inch, feet gliding across the floor, calculating every exit, every door. But he was already moving. In one swift motion, Bryce lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her violently down a side hallway. She tried to twist free, but his grip was iron. He dragged her through the emergency exit, down a stairwell, and into the abandoned gymnasium beneath the school. The lights were out. The room was cold, hollow, echoing with their every breath. Dust floated in the air like falling ash. The place hadn't been used in years, not since the newer athletic wing opened. Perfect. He shoved her against the wall, hard. Her shoulder slammed into the concrete, pain shooting down her arm. She gasped, but didn't cry out. Wouldn't give him that. Bryce stepped back just enough to look her over, his expression twisted with rage and disbelief. Wiretap, he hissed. You think you can spy on me? On my school? Do you have any idea what you've done? Raina didn't answer. Her body ached, but her mind was razor sharp. The mic in her necklace had been crushed during the fall. Her phone was still in her jacket pocket if she could get to it. But she needed time. He didn't give it. Bryce slammed his fist into the wall just inches from her face. Dust exploded from the concrete. You're not a cop, he spat. You're nothing. A little girl pretending to be something special. His voice dropped lower. You should have kept your mouth shut. But now, you're going to disappear, just like the others. That word disappear hit her harder than the wall ever could. She saw Simone's face, and something inside her snapped. He reached for her again, grabbing the collar of her jacket, but this time, she moved first. She pivoted sharply, dropping her weight and twisting out of his grip, just as she'd been trained. Her elbow came up fast, cracking him hard across the jaw. Bryce staggered back, stunned. For a moment, just a moment, his mask slipped. Pain and confusion flickered across his face. He hadn't expected resistance. Raina didn't wait. She moved in, swift and precise. Years of training in every strike. A jab to his throat, a kick to his knee. Bryce grunted, collapsing onto one leg. But he was stronger than he looked. He roared, grabbing her by the wrist and yanking her toward him. They crashed to the floor, rolling across the dust-covered mats. He tried to pin her, fists flying, wild now, sloppy with rage. One punch landed, her vision blurred, but she didn't stop. She twisted her body, driving her knee into his ribs. He shouted, clutching his side. She scrambled to her feet, chest heaving, eyes blazing. Stay down, she warned, her voice low, trembling with fury. But Bryce didn't listen. Blood ran from his nose. His suit was torn. His carefully crafted image was cracked now, and underneath it, the real Bryce Langston emerged, and he was furious. You're dead, he growled, crawling to his feet. You don't get it, do you? I own this place. I own you. Raina reached into her jacket. Her hand closed around her phone. She tapped the emergency code on the side, activating a silent ping to her agency. If she could just buy 30 more seconds, Bryce charged again. They collided midair, crashing into the bleachers. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but she held on, fighting with everything she had. Every punch, every block, every strike was fueled by Simone's ghost, by the memory of that cold morgue, by every time she was told to wait for justice. Not this time. With a final surge of strength, she grabbed Bryce by the collar and slammed his head against the metal beam behind him. He went limp. Breathing hard, Raina stepped back, trembling. Dust swirled around her. Blood dripped from her brow. Her shirt was torn, her knuckles bruised, but she was still standing. Barely. Her phone buzzed once back up en route. Too late. The door slammed open. The harsh beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, followed by the frantic echo of boots slamming against the old gym floor. Two campus security officers burst in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the chaotic scene. Dust still hung in the air, stirred by the fight. Raina's chest heaved. Her lip was split. Blood dripped down her jaw. Her hands were raised in instinctive surrender, but her eyes, sharp and burning, were fixed on the boy groaning at her feet. And then came the shift. Bryce Langston curled into himself, dragging one leg back like it had been shattered, his breath ragged and uneven. He let out a whimper, then another. Louder this time, practiced, controlled. His performance began. "She tried to kill me," he gasped, coughing into his sleeve, smearing blood like war paint. She just snapped." The guards didn't hesitate. They rushed past him and zeroed in on Raina, shouting commands she couldn't process fast enough. "Hands in the air. Get on the ground now. Do it now." "No, wait, he attacked me," Raina cried, backing away, still trying to find her breath. "He dragged me here. He knew who I was." One of the guards surged forward, grabbing her arm, twisting it behind her back with brutal force. A shock of pain tore through her shoulder as her knees buckled. The other one ripped her backpack away and tossed it aside like trash. "She's got something in here," he muttered, rummaging through it without a warrant, without a word of protocol. "She's been stalking me," Bryce croaked from the corner, voice cracking perfectly on cue. "Recording me. She said she'd ruin my life. Look at me." The flashlight beam flicked toward him. Torn shirt, bloody nose, wet eyes. He looked like the victim. And Raina? She looked like everything they feared. A black girl with clenched fists, blood on her face and fury in her eyes. "I said I'm a federal agent," she shouted, panic rising now. "Check my ID call, Agent Sloan. I was undercover." But no one listened. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in Bryce Langston. They hauled her up by the arms and slammed her against the wall, her cheeks scraping the rough cinder block. Cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. She winced, not from the pain, but from the humiliation. From the way the guards wouldn't meet her eyes. From the way Bryce smiled, just barely behind their backs. It was all part of his game. A game she was losing. "Please," she tried again. "You have to let me explain. She's lying," Bryce whimpered. "She's dangerous. I think she's been following me for weeks." "She's got equipment in her bag," one guard confirmed, pulling out the mic transmitter from her necklace like it was a bomb. "What is this? Who are you working for?" Raina's voice cracked. "I'm working for you. I'm with the task force. This was a sanctioned investigation. Look at the files. There are recordings in that drive. Names, faces. He's part of a trafficking network. He's the one you should be arresting." The guards exchanged glances. Then one of them muttered, "Yeah, we've heard enough," and shoved her forward. Her knees scraped the floor as she stumbled. Her voice rose into a scream. "You're making a mistake. He killed my sister." But her words bounced off the gym walls and dissolved into silence. They dragged her out like a criminal, past Bryce, who slumped against the wall like some innocent, broken boy. And he had the nerve to look at her right in the eye and whisper, "Told you no one would believe you." The hallway outside the gym was cold and full of voices. More security, a school nurse, one of the deans. They all swarmed around Bryce, draping blankets over his shoulders, handing him tissues, treating him like royalty who'd survived a tragedy. "Poor thing," someone whispered. "She just went crazy on him." "No wonder. Girls like her. They always have a chip on their shoulder." Raina heard it all. Every word stabbed like glass under the skin. They didn't know her. They didn't know her story, but they'd already written the ending. They shoved her into a cruiser without reading her rights. No one asked her side. No one called her handler. No one paused long enough to even consider that maybe, just maybe, the golden boy might be lying. That was the most terrifying part. Not the cuffs, not the blood, but the ease with which the truth had been erased. Just one accusation from a boy with power, and everything she had built came crashing down. She sat in the back seat of the cruiser, her face pressed against the cold glass, watching the school blur past in streaks of fluorescent light. Her ears rang, her hands ached, her mind screamed. She had done everything right. She'd gone by the book, gathered the evidence, played the part, risked her life. And yet here she was, branded, broken, silenced. A monster in their eyes. The truth for now was buried beneath lies, privilege, and a name. Langston. And as the cruiser pulled away, sirens wailing into the night, Raina Monroe realized the system wasn't just broken, it was rigged, and she was its latest casualty. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the narrative was no longer hers to tell. The truth had already been buried, rewritten by headlines, twisted by privilege, and signed off by silence. And so, just days later, Raina found herself in a courtroom that wasn't built to hear her side. It was built to destroy it. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled teachers, students, reporters, and curious strangers, all gathered to watch the trial of the girl who had dared to lay hands on Bryce Langston. To them, Raina Monroe was no longer a student, no longer a person. She was a spectacle, a villain, a headline waiting to be written. She sat silently at the defense table, wrists uncuffed but dignity shackled, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Every breath she took was measured, controlled. She had to be careful. One wrong look, one misplaced word, and the courtroom would turn on her like wolves. The prosecutor rose from his seat with a confidence that reeked of entitlement. He adjusted his suit, turned to the jury, and spoke like he was narrating a horror story. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not just a case of simple school violence. What we have is a dangerous individual, a volatile young woman with a clear history of aggression who infiltrated this school under false pretenses and launched a brutal, unprovoked attack on an innocent boy. He gestured to Bryce, who sat behind his lawyer like a porcelain doll bandaged, silent and perfectly pitiful. The bruises, carefully accentuated with makeup, painted him as the victim, a fragile golden boy caught in the crossfire of some manufactured rage. She faked her identity, the prosecutor continued, voice rising. She carried illegal surveillance equipment. She stalked Mr. Langston. And then when he tried to confront her about her behavior, she snapped. Violently, viciously, Raina clenched her fist beneath the table. Her fingernails bit into her palms. That's not what happened. That's not the truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but her court-appointed lawyer, clearly overwhelmed, placed a hand on her arm. A silent warning. Not yet. The prosecutor walked closer to the jury box, lowering his tone for effect. We ask ourselves, what kind of person does this? What kind of young woman comes into a school with hidden microphones, with secret recordings under a false identity? What kind of person attacks a fellow student so severely he needed emergency treatment? He paused for dramatic effect. I'll tell you what kind, he said coldly. A violent one, a manipulator, a predator. Raina stood. The courtroom gasped. Her lawyer nearly fell out of her chair. Your Honor, Raina said, her voice steady but shaking underneath. I'd like to speak. The judge looked up, clearly annoyed. You'll speak when your attorney calls you to the stand. This is a lie, Raina continued, louder this time. I wasn't a student. I'm an undercover federal agent. Everything they're saying is wrong. I had authorization. I had evidence. The prosecutor scoffed. Objection, Your Honor. Sustained. Miss Monroe, sit down. One more outburst and I will have you removed from this courtroom. Raina's breathing grew shallow. She turned toward the gallery, searching, waiting, looking for someone in uniform, someone from the bureau, someone who would stand up and say, she's telling the truth. But the seats were filled with strangers, the people who had promised to protect her gone, silent. There was no badge, no backup, no salvation. The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel for order. We will continue without interruptions, he said coldly. The jury will disregard the defendant's remarks. Raina sat down slowly, her legs weak beneath her. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. Why hadn't Sloan shown up? Why hadn't they submitted her clearance? Where were the files? The encrypted drive? The recordings? They were supposed to be entered into evidence. They were supposed to prove she wasn't a criminal, but no one had delivered them. And without the truth, all that remained was the narrative Bryce had created, clean, rehearsed, weaponized. She sat still, utterly still, as the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, like vultures circling their prey. The prosecutor had returned to his seat, smug and composed. The judge was flipping through paperwork, clearly ready to adjourn for the day. The jury glanced around, some nodding slightly as if the verdict had already been decided in their minds. Raina Monroe sat at the defense table with her hands folded, not because she was calm, but because if she let go, she was afraid she might start shaking and never stop. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She just stared straight ahead. Across the aisle, Bryce Langston reclined comfortably in his chair, as if the courtroom were his personal lounge. His arm rested casually on the chair beside him, his suit immaculate despite the injuries they claimed he'd suffered. A thin bandage crossed the bridge of his nose, just enough to inspire sympathy without disrupting his flawless image. And then he smiled. Slow, smug, sickening. It wasn't a grin for the jury or the cameras. It was for her, only her. A private message. I told you so. Raina felt something inside her crack. Not break, no. Breaking was loud. This was quieter, deeper, like a foundation shifting underground. The kind of damage that doesn't show until everything starts to collapse. Because she knew what that smile meant. He had won. Not just the courtroom, not just the narrative, but the entire machine. The justice system, the school board, the press, the people who were supposed to stand with her. They had all bent around Bryce like gravity, while she had been left to burn. The silence in her heart was louder than the gavel. This wasn't a trial, it was a funeral, a burial, and the truth was the one being lowered into the ground. She had screamed it, she had bled for it, and still it meant nothing. She glanced toward the door, half expecting, half praying that anyone from her unit would burst in. A late arriving hero, a flash of credentials, a statement that would turn the tide. But the door stayed closed. No help came. The evidence had vanished. The recordings were inconclusive. The encrypted drive had somehow been corrupted. And Agent Sloan? Radio silence. Raina was alone. She had never felt it so completely. Even her own lawyer wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. And Bryce was now gently shaking his head like he pitied her. Like she was the delusional one. It made her stomach churn. She thought of Simone, of the hospital sheet pulled over her lifeless body, of the unanswered questions, of the forced silence that followed. And now here Raina was reliving it, again. Watching lies win, watching power bury truth, watching the same pattern play out, frame by frame. They stripped her of everything: her title, her truth, her voice. But they forgot one thing. The fire they tried to extinguish was still burning. The courtroom was drowning in silence. Not the respectful kind, but the suffocating stillness of a place that believed justice was about to be served blind, final, and absolute. The judge lifted his gavel slowly, his expression impassive, the air around him heavy with anticipation. The prosecutor sat smugly in his seat, fingers steepled beneath his chin, already savoring the victory. Bryce Langston shifted slightly, brushing invisible lint off his suit jacket, wearing the face of a man who knew the outcome long before the trial had even begun. The judge cleared his throat. Before I render my final judgment, are there any last statements from the defense? Her public defender remained seated. She had nothing left. No evidence, no witnesses, no voice. But Raina did, and she wasn't going down in silence. They thought they'd broken her. They thought she was done. They were wrong. Her fingers, trembling but deliberate, moved beneath the desk. Taped underneath was the smallest of tools, a flat pin she'd fashioned in her cell and hidden during transport. The guards had missed it. Everyone had. That was their mistake. She twisted. Click. The cuffs released. The prosecutor's eyes widened. Raina stood. What do you think you're—" Her public defender gasped, standing up beside her in panic. But Raina didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She reached into her boot and pulled out a small USB drive, the last backup she had, the one she'd risked everything to smuggle in. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp and controlled, echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. "Before you declare me guilty, you need to see what you've all refused to look at." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned. Phones were raised. The judge slammed his gavel. "Miss Monroe, you are out of order." "No," she snapped, eyes burning. "This entire courtroom is out of order." She walked past her stunned attorney, straight to the bailiff's desk. One of the guards stepped forward instinctively, hand twitching toward his holster. "I have no weapon," she said, calmly holding the USB in the air. "Only the truth." She turned to the judge, her voice rising. "You can either continue this sham and condemn an innocent woman, or you can do your job." The room went still again. After a tense beat, the judge exhaled. "Play it." The bailiff, hesitant but obedient, plugged the USB into the court's display system. The screen flickered, static. Then footage. It was raw, shaky, but damning. A hallway at Stonebridge Academy. Bryce Langston laughing, handing out small plastic bags to 3 different students. One of them a girl no older than 16, visibly crying as he pushed something into her locker. Cut to another clip. Bryce in the locker room, backing a student into a corner. His voice clear as day. "You say one word and I'll make sure no college ever touches your name." The final clip hit hardest. A teacher, accepting cash, nodding, saying, "Don't worry, Bryce. You're protected." The courtroom imploded. Gasps turned to chaos. Reporters jumped to their feet. One juror covered her mouth. The prosecutor stood, face pale, trying to speak, but nothing came out. And then Raina pulled out her final weapon. From her waistband, she revealed a thin leather wallet, flipped it open. Inside, her federal badge. "My name is Agent Raina Monroe," she said loud and clear. "I've been embedded at Stonebridge for 9 months, investigating a drug and exploitation network that stretches far beyond this school. Everything you've seen is real. And if you still think I'm the criminal here, then you're part of the problem." The judge's mouth opened, closed, his face contorted between outrage and disbelief. "This evidence was not submitted through official channels," he said weakly. "Because it would have been buried," she snapped. "Just like the complaints. Just like the girls. Just like my sister." A beat passed. Then she turned to the gallery. To the students who were silenced. To the girls who were bribed or threatened. To the parents who never got answers. "This," she pointed to the screen, "is what you were never supposed to see." Bryce shot up from his chair. "She's lying," he screamed. "This is fake. It's all fake. My father will bury you." His attorney grabbed his arm, but Bryce yanked away, wild-eyed. "She assaulted me. She's obsessed. She broke into my locker." No one was listening anymore. All eyes were on the screen, and then back on Raina. The judge's gavel slammed again. "We're taking a recess," he said, voice shaky. "Clear the courtroom. The jury will remain. Bailiff, escort Miss Monroe, Agent Monroe, to the chambers." But as the bailiff approached, Raina didn't move. Instead, she turned to the judge one last time. "You saw it. Everyone saw it. The question now is whether you'll actually do something about it, or if you'll let this system protect another predator in a suit." The room exploded into noise. Court officers moved to separate reporters from the front benches. The judge barked more orders, and in the middle of it all, Raina stood still, calm in the storm, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. Because now the world finally knew. But the battle wasn't over. As the room emptied, she caught the judge staring at her eyes, calculating, cautious. Because even with the truth exposed, the system wasn't built to yield. Power didn't like to lose. And somewhere deep inside that judge's hesitation, she saw it. The machine was still trying to bury her, still trying to twist the facts, still trying to figure out if they could call it a mistrial, suppress the footage, dismiss her as unstable. The corruption ran deeper than Bryce, and Raina knew it. The war was far from won, but for the first time since Simone's death, she wasn't losing. She had cracked the wall. Now she just needed to bring the whole damn building down. And she would, no matter how long it took. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The story ignited like a match thrown into dry brush. What had started as a courtroom whisper turned into a national firestorm. Within hours of Raina Monroe's defiant declaration in court, her badge raised, the footage revealed the media landscape exploded. Her name was everywhere. Cable news, online blogs, primetime anchors. Headlines screamed questions the justice system had hoped would stay buried. Why was a federal agent tried as a criminal? Who covered up the evidence? What is Senator Langston hiding? Raina's face, once vilified as a violent, dangerous teenager, now became a symbol of systemic betrayal. Images of her standing tall in the courtroom, cuff-free and unflinching, flashed across every screen in America. But what truly rattled the public wasn't just the footage, it was the silence that had preceded it. How could a trained, credentialed federal agent be left to rot under false charges? Why had her evidence been lost? Why hadn't anyone from her agency shown up to testify? And then came the real bombshell. A team of independent investigative journalists, hungry for the truth, began digging. Financial disclosures, campaign records, internal court communications, everything was fair game. And after days of silence from official sources, a name finally emerged at the center of the storm. Judge Marcus Harrow, the man who had presided over Raina's trial, the man who had denied her the right to speak, the man who had dismissed every piece of exonerating evidence without a second glance. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had made a deal. An expose aired live on national television, complete with bank statements and financial trails. Judge Harrow's two most recent re-election campaigns had been quietly bankrolled by super PACs tied directly to Senator Charles Langston Bryce's father. The numbers were damning. Over $400,000 in contributions, funneled through layered LLCs and legal fronts, hidden in plain sight. It was all there. The motive, the money, the manipulation. Suddenly, everything about the trial made perfect, horrifying sense. The cold indifference, the refusal to admit evidence, the blind eye to protocol. The gavel wasn't impartial, it had already been bought. Raina watched it all unfold from the safe house, the television casting flickering light across her tired face. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Journalists, attorneys, former colleagues. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone wanted her version. Everyone suddenly cared. But where were they when she stood alone in that courtroom? Where were they when she was screaming the truth into a void that refused to listen? Now, as America reeled from the revelation, Raina remained quiet. Not out of fear, but clarity. Because this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a reckoning. Judge Harrow was placed under formal investigation. Senator Langston refused interviews, but was caught leaving a closed-door meeting with top officials. And Bryce? He disappeared. No school, no public appearances, no statement. He had vanished into the same shadows where Raina had nearly lost everything. But this time, the shadows wouldn't protect him, because the truth was out and it had a name, a face, and a badge. And her name was Raina Monroe. Freedom didn't feel like freedom. When the door to the holding facility finally opened, Raina Monroe stepped into the sunlight, not as a hero, not as a symbol of justice, but as a liability, a tightly controlled, closely monitored, inconvenient truth. Her cuffs were gone, but the restrictions were clear. She was not to return to the Stonebridge case. She was not to speak to the press. She was not to pursue any further investigation into the Langston network. She had exposed the rot, but now they wanted her silent. Officially, the agency called it protective reassignment. Unofficially, it was exile, a strategic muzzle on the one person who knew too much and wasn't afraid to say it. They let her walk free, but stripped her badge, her access, her authority. The very system she had once fought for now feared her, and the one man she thought she could trust? Nowhere to be found. Victor Sloan, her handler, her mentor, the man who had recruited her straight out of the academy, the man who had told her to go deep, stay quiet, and believe in the mission. He was gone. No messages, no visits, no explanations. When she called his number, it rang once, then disconnected. When she asked about him at headquarters, she was met with stiff smiles and empty phrases. He's on leave. He's handling another matter. We can't comment. But Raina knew the look in their eyes. They were hiding something. And if there was one thing her time at Stonebridge had taught her, it was this. When people in power start hiding, the truth is always worth chasing, even if it means chasing it alone. So she broke the first rule they gave her. She turned her apartment into a war room, windows blacked out, burners stacked beside her laptop, a whiteboard covered in tangled threads of names, dates, connections. She didn't have her badge, but she had her brain, and she still remembered the agency's back doors. She didn't just hack the surface systems, she went deeper. Layer by encrypted layer, she peeled back the protective skin of the Bureau's internal archive. At first, it was just routine correspondence, travel logs, personnel files, reassignments. But then, buried deep inside a restricted folder labeled Langston Sensitive Flagged, she found something that made her blood run cold. A financial transaction, one she was never meant to see. $85,000, transferred 3 weeks before the trial, from a shell corporation registered in the Caymans to a personal account belonging to Victor Sloan. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Then she clicked again and saw the memo line. Consulting L1 clearance required. It wasn't consulting, it was betrayal. He had sold her out. Victor Sloan, the man with steel gray eyes and a voice like calm before battle. The mentor who believed in her when no one else did. When she was just a rookie, young, determined, and overlooked, it was Sloan who pulled her aside after her first evaluation, looked her straight in the eye and said, "You don't need to be louder, you just need to be sharper." And you are. To Raina, he wasn't just a handler, he was a compass, a shield, a rare figure of integrity in a system too often swallowed by politics. He taught her how to track criminals, how to read between lies, how to disappear in plain sight. He'd reminded her again and again, we don't serve headlines, we serve the truth. So when she uncovered the bank records cold, undeniable, her entire world splintered. The name on the offshore account was his. The money, tens of thousands, traced back to Langston Holdings. And just like that, everything unraveled. The missed calls, the vanished reports, the silence when she was on trial, facing a room full of people who wanted to crucify her. Sloan had vanished not because he was forced to, but because he was paid to, bought, owned. Raina stared at the screen as the numbers glared back like ghosts. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear apart the world around her. But instead, she sat still, frozen in betrayal, so sharp it numbed her rage. This wasn't just a man she trusted. This was the man who told her to take the Stonebridge mission, who promised her backup, who told her, "You'll never be alone out there." And yet, when the gavel fell, when she stood accused, alone and bleeding, he had turned his back. He had done worse. He had sold her out. Her eyes burned not from tears, but from restraint, from the overwhelming soul-deep understanding that the man who taught her how to spot deception had become its master. It wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was personal. Sloan had known what Bryce was. He had known what Langston was covering up. He had known what Raina was walking into, and he let her walk in anyway. Every lesson, every mission, every late-night phone call, poisoned now, twisted into manipulation. She had trusted him with her life, and he traded it for a payday. Her fists clenched. The betrayal didn't just shake her faith in Sloan. It shook her faith in everything. She needed answers, not rumors, not theories. The betrayal was already a scar, but now Raina wanted the truth behind it. So she did what no agent ever wants to do. She arranged a meeting with the man who broke her, face to face. No backup, no script. Just pain and the need to know why. The meeting place was neutral, at least. That's what Sloan had said. A rundown park on the edge of the city, long forgotten by the developers who once promised a vibrant future. Rusted swings swayed in the wind. Graffiti scarred the concrete benches. It was the kind of place people passed without ever seeing. Raina arrived first. She kept her hood up, hands buried deep in the pockets of her jacket. The air was cold, but her blood ran colder. She'd texted Sloan one line, no context. "We talk." One time, no handlers. He showed up 20 minutes late, not in a suit, not in the pressed authority she remembered. He looked thinner, tired, haunted. He approached slowly, his eyes flicking toward the shadows, toward every corner, like a man used to watching his own back. "Raina," he said, voice low, weary. She didn't speak. He sat down across from her, sighing like the weight of years had collapsed on his shoulders. "I figured this was coming," he muttered. "You lied to me," she said, her voice razor sharp. "You sold me out." Sloan didn't argue, didn't deflect. Instead, he looked her straight in the eye. "They have my daughter." 3 seconds passed. 4. The words didn't register at first. Raina blinked, her jaw tightening. "What?" Sloan exhaled hard. "Langston's people. They took her months ago, right after you went under. No ransom, no threats. Just gone. I filed reports. Nothing. Nobody listened. Then one night I got a burner call. No caller ID, just a voice that said, 'Play ball, or she disappears for good.'" His voice cracked on the last word. "I didn't have a choice." Raina's stomach twisted. She wanted to scream, to rage, to punch the bench until it shattered. But she didn't move, because in that moment, she saw it, the trembling hands, the bloodshot eyes, the guilt he carried like a second skin. It wasn't a lie. Langston had taken everything from him, too. Sloan rubbed his temples. "They didn't just want silence. They wanted you isolated. They wanted the Bureau to cut you loose, make you look unstable, reckless. They knew you were the only one who could connect the dots. So they came for me, the one person you trusted." Raina stared at him, heart pounding. "You watched me walk into that courtroom alone," she whispered. "You knew what they'd do to me. I thought I could contain it, that maybe if I just stalled them, played dumb, they'd let her go. But then it spun out. You were arrested, and I panicked. You left me to die in there." Sloan nodded slowly. "I know." There was silence between them, thick, suffocating. Raina's fist clenched in her coat pockets, where a small digital recorder was nestled between her fingers, already running. She hadn't come for justice. She'd come for proof, and now she had it. "I know what I did, Raina," he continued. "I'll carry that forever. But you need to understand. When someone has your child, when they look you in the eye and say they'll make her disappear, what would you have done?" Raina's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know, but I know I would have told the truth. To someone. To me." Sloan's shoulders collapsed. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I just needed you to know. I'm sorry." The word hung in the air like an open wound. Raina looked away, her eyes scanning the crumbling playground. So this was the cost of power, twisting good men into traitors, turning loyalty into currency. Sloan wasn't evil. He was broken, compromised. And in Langston's world, that was all they needed to own you. She stood slowly, the wind catching her coat. "You won't hear from me again," she said. "But the next time you see a news alert with my name on it, you'll know exactly what's coming." Sloan looked up, blinking. "What are you going to do?" Raina's eyes burned with fire. "Finish what you were too afraid to start." Then she walked away, the recording safe in her pocket and a war roaring in her chest. The moment she walked away from Sloan, she knew sorrow alone wouldn't change anything. Regret couldn't fix betrayal. Injustice didn't wait for apologies. Raina had the truth in her pocket, and this time, she wouldn't just survive the system. She would dismantle it. One move at a time. The recorder clicked off with a quiet finality. Raina stood in the center of her apartment, heart pounding, breath shallow, the weight of Victor Sloan's confession burning like fire in her coat pocket. The words still echoed in her mind. "They have my daughter." But sympathy couldn't eclipse what she had just done. She had the truth, and this time, she wasn't going to bury it. She was going to weaponize it. By morning, the file had been transferred. She didn't send it through official channels, not after everything the Bureau had done to silence her. Instead, she slipped the digital copy into the hands of one person she knew would still care about integrity. Special Agent Aria Kent, Internal Affairs, incorruptible. feared by half the building for her obsession with evidence and zero tolerance for backroom deals. Kent didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. The tight grip on the recorder and the fire in her eyes said enough. Now it was time to move. Langston wasn't just protected, he was the protection. A man who operated behind polished podiums and fake smiles, whose money reached into media, politics, law enforcement, and beyond. Arresting him outright wouldn't work. Not without something airtight, unshakable. She needed to catch him in the act, and that meant bait. Raina sat in front of her map-strewn wall, red strings and photographs connecting a tangled web of names. She followed the money trails, the recruitment patterns, the manipulation tactics. There was one common thread: control. Langston didn't deal in violence. He dealt in leverage, fear, debt, secrets. So she gave him one. A leak. She crafted a digital trail just believable enough to draw blood. A fake informant. A name Langston's people would recognize from old files. She dropped it into a chat room frequented by Langston's lower-tier enforcers, disguised as a burner account leaking inside intel on an agent willing to flip. Then she waited. It didn't take long. By the next day, she got the ping encrypted, untraceable, but familiar in tone. A request for a meeting, private, off the record, from one of Langston's most trusted men, Malcolm Price. Political advisor by day, shadow broker by night. This was it. She would walk straight into the fire. But this time she wasn't walking in alone. She met with Kent that night, her voice steady, her plan clear. I'll wear the wire. You stay dark. No SWAT teams. No black vans. If Langston even smells law enforcement, he disappears. But if we do this right, we get him talking. Kent hesitated. You're putting your life on the line. Raina's eyes were calm. I've already paid that price. Now I'm collecting. The next 48 hours were a blur of prep covert comms, micro recorders, dead drop locations. Raina rehearsed every word she'd say. She wouldn't accuse. She wouldn't threaten. She would invite Langston to confess. Arrogance was his weakness. He thought the world revolved around his secrets. She would give him the illusion of control, and then she would burn it down. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. All the traps were set. The bait had been taken. Now it was time to walk into the lion's den and make the lion roar loud enough for the whole world to hear. The room was quiet, too quiet. It was an abandoned penthouse under renovation, unfinished walls, exposed wires, and shattered glass along the edges of the marble floor. The perfect place for men like Langston to whisper their ugliest truths without fear of being heard. But tonight, every sound was being recorded. Raina sat at one end of the table, her posture composed, eyes sharp, dressed in plain civilian clothes with nothing to suggest who she was or what she was planning. Across from her stood Charles Langston, polished as ever in a tailored navy suit, his gold watch glinting under the dim lights like a crown he never intended to take off. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. Power like his didn't beg it towered. Next to him was Malcolm Price, his longtime political fixer, guarding the door like a loyal shadow. In the far corner, Victor Sloan stood stiff, shoulders heavy with guilt, eyes lowered, as if the floor held more comfort than anything in the room. Langston glanced around once, then let out a soft, condescending laugh. "So this is your plan?" he sneered, his voice dripping arrogance. "You gather the traitors and bring me here like it's some kind of negotiation?" Raina didn't flinch. "I think it's time we talk without cameras, without speeches. Just truth." Langston stepped closer, jaw tightening. "Truth?" he echoed. "You want truth, Agent Monroe?" He turned to Sloan, voice rising like venom boiling to the surface. "This is your idea of loyalty?" he snapped. "You think you're anything more than a cog in the machine?" Sloan raised his eyes for the first time, barely able to meet Langston's gaze. "I did what you asked. I kept her quiet." Langston erupted, voice thunderous. "Kept her quiet? She's sitting right there, recording every damn word I say, no doubt. You incompetent coward." Raina's pulse spiked, but her expression didn't waver. Langston stepped back, laughing bitterly. "You both still don't get it. I own this game. I built the rules. You think justice gives a damn about truth? Number it bows to money, and I have more of it than God. His voice dropped to a growl, aimed like a dagger. You, he hissed at Sloan, were nothing but a convenient tool. A scared little father with a daughter dangling by a thread. You did exactly what I paid you to do, because that's what people like you do. You survive by crawling. Sloan clenched his fists, trembling. You think this ends here? Langston spat, now turning to Raina. You think a wiretap changes anything? The judge who signs your warrants owes me his election. The media that praises you bought and sold. I can bury you with a phone call. Raina stood slowly, reaching into her jacket. Langston froze. But she didn't pull a weapon. She pulled a warrant, signed, sealed, legal, and behind it came the sound he hadn't expected. Boots, doors, voices shouting. From the corners of the penthouse, officers emerged plainclothes, tactical, armed, SWAT, FBI, local PD, flooding the room like a rising tide, weapons raised and aimed. Langston's face dropped in slow-motion horror. This is a setup, he whispered. Raina's voice was ice. No, Mr. Langston, this is accountability. An officer moved in and cuffed him with swift efficiency. Langston's protest began immediately. You can't do this. I'm a United States Senator. I demand to speak with... No one's listening anymore. Raina cut in, eyes locked on him. You've spoken enough. Malcolm Price tried to back toward the exit, but was quickly restrained and shoved to the floor. Victor Sloan stood frozen, eyes glassy. For a moment, he didn't speak. Couldn't. Langston twisted toward him, red-faced, desperate. You spineless traitor! I protected your family. Sloan met his gaze, quiet and broken. Number you used them. As Langston was dragged away, still shouting threats that held less weight than ever before, the room finally fell into a still silence. Raina let out a slow breath. Not victory, not peace, but justice. Hard won, delayed, and finally delivered. Taking down Langston was just the spark. What followed was a wildfire unstoppable, uncontainable. As the arrests piled up and the truth spread like shockwaves through every corner of power, the world turned to the one woman who had lit the match. And this time, Raina Monroe would not whisper her truth. She would speak it to the world. The headlines came like a tidal wave. National scandal, elite school, drug network, tied to high-ranking officials. Senator Langston arrested FBI, uncovers, web of corruption. Whistleblower agent brings down, political empire. Over the span of 72 hours, the carefully constructed empire that had shielded the predators of Stonebridge Academy collapsed in front of a stunned nation. The footage of Langston's arrest went viral within minutes, but that was just the beginning. Once the dam broke, the flood couldn't be stopped. Agents raided Stonebridge the next morning. Hidden compartments were discovered behind lockers. Confidential student files had been erased or rewritten. Surveillance systems had been tampered with, and buried beneath it all names. Dozens of them. Victims and accomplices. The school's principal, Margaret Elson, was arrested on charges of conspiracy and obstruction. She had knowingly altered records, silenced student complaints, and accepted bribes from the Langston Foundation. 2 guidance counselors were removed in handcuffs, charged with facilitating illegal access to vulnerable students' psychological profiles. A science teacher, once praised for mentoring at-risk girls, had been part of the recruitment pipeline all along, but it didn't end at the school gates. Emails, wire transfers, and testimonies linked the network to local police officers, members of the school board, and even officials inside juvenile court. Judges had pushed harsh sentences on students who defied the system, all while protecting those who profited from it. The house of cards didn't fall, it imploded. And at the center of the wreckage stood the one person they tried hardest to silence. Raina Monroe, the girl they once called violent, the agent they left to burn, the voice they tried to erase. She didn't vanish into the background. She walked straight into the spotlight. The live interview was scheduled for 8 p.m. Every major news network aired it simultaneously. The studio was quiet, But the tension in the control room was electric. People gathered around TVs in homes, schools, government buildings. They weren't just tuning in for a story, they were tuning in for a reckoning. Raina sat tall, composed, no badge, no uniform, just a black blazer, a calm voice, and eyes that had seen too much. The interviewer asked her about the mission, about the betrayal, about the pain. But the moment the world would never forget came when the cameras focused solely on her, and the host asked, "What do you want people to understand most after everything?" Raina didn't hesitate. Her voice was calm, but every word hit like a thunderclap. Justice is not something you wait for. It's not something handed down by people in power. It is something you fight for bloody, bruised, and alone if you have to. You claw it from the hands of those who would rather keep it buried. Justice isn't polite. It's not clean. It's not comfortable. It's dangerous. But it's necessary. I learned that the hard way. I stood in a courtroom where no one believed me. I was stripped of my title, of my truth, and nearly of my freedom. And still I fought. Because justice isn't a gift. It's a war. And if we want to win it, we have to be louder than the lies. We have to be willing to bleed for the truth. And most of all, we have to refuse to stay silent. The room was silent when she finished, not a breath, not a whisper. Then the world erupted. The interview was replayed across every screen, shared by activists, quoted by politicians, played in classrooms and congressional hearings alike. Raina's name became more than a headline. It became a warning to those in power. Truth doesn't die in silence. It fights back. The message behind Raina Monroe's story is not subtle. It's a scream, a defiant, blood-soaked warning carved into the walls of every courtroom, school hallway, and government office that tried to crush her. It tells us that injustice doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it smiles behind a podium. Sometimes it shakes your hand and calls you partner. Raina's journey exposes the brutal reality that even the most well-structured systems, education, law enforcement, politics, can become weapons in the wrong hands. Her story tears off the mask of respectability and reveals how power protects itself by silencing truth, vilifying victims, and punishing the brave. She was a federal agent, trained and prepared. But even with her credentials, she was thrown to the wolves, framed, humiliated, and nearly erased. Why? Because she got too close to the rot at the core. Because she saw what wasn't meant to be seen. Because she spoke when she was supposed to stay quiet. But Raina's story isn't just about betrayal, it's about what happens after. After the cuffs, after the courtroom, after the lies. It's about what happens when someone chooses to keep fighting even after everyone tells them the battle is already lost. She fought alone. She was bruised, bloodied, broken, but she never stopped. And because of her, the truth came out. Not just about a senator or a school, but about the cost of silence, about how justice is never freely given. It's ripped from the grip of corruption, held up by people willing to sacrifice everything. The message is this: justice is not gentle, and it is never convenient. If we want it, if we truly want a world where power answers to truth, then we must be willing to face the storm like Raina did. We must challenge systems built to ignore pain. We must protect the voices that expose what others want buried. And when the moment comes, when we are forced to choose between comfort and courage, we must choose to stand, even when it shakes us. Because if Raina taught us anything, it's that real justice doesn't come in whispers. It comes in war cries. If Raina's story moved you, if it made your heart race or your fists clench, don't let it end here. Click like to honor her fight. Hit subscribe to join us in sharing powerful stories of justice, courage, and truth. And share this video to remind the world, silence protects no one, but truth changes everything. Arrogant politician insults. Black judge in court. What happens next leaves the entire room frozen. The smell of ash still clung to the wind like a curse that refused to lift. Smoke hung low over what used to be the heart of Silver Grove, a neighborhood now reduced to blackened skeletons of homes and dreams. Cracked picture frames lay shattered in the dirt, their glass melted by fire, the faces inside barely recognizable. A woman knelt on the scorched remains of her porch, her hands trembling as she picked through the debris with blistered fingers. Somewhere beneath the rubble, she believed, was her mother's wedding ring. She had nothing left but that hope. Down the street, a 10-year-old boy stood motionless beside the carcass of what used to be his bedroom. His face was streaked with soot and silent tears. In his hands, he clutched the leg of a half-burnt stuffed bear, its eyes melted, one ear gone. He didn't scream or speak. He just held the ruined toy to his chest like it might bring back everything he'd lost. Behind him, his father kicked through broken tiles and twisted metal, calling out a name he already knew wouldn't answer. People moved like ghosts, slow, aimless, hollow. The fire had taken everything. And it wasn't just the flames that destroyed their lives. It was what came after. Silence. Insurance companies citing fine print. Emergency funds mysteriously delayed. No officials on the ground. No answers. Just microphones and cameras. On every TV screen, Senator Patrick Langford's face appeared, perfectly composed, perfectly rehearsed. He stood at a gleaming podium, wrapped in the American flag, eyes glassy with fabricated concern. "This tragedy," he said, his voice rich and solemn, "has shaken me deeply. My heart goes out to every family suffering loss. We will rebuild, together." But the people of Silver Grove weren't buying it. They'd seen the leaked reports, the maintenance logs showing that the power lines hadn't been inspected in 6 years, the emails suggesting Langford had blocked infrastructure upgrades in exchange for campaign contributions, and then just days after the flames, those same lands, still smoldering, had been quietly purchased by shell companies tied to Langford's inner circle. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a setup, a sacrifice, and they were the offering. At the heart of the fury stood one man who hadn't asked to be a hero, Judge Elias Monroe. He didn't know it yet, but he had just been assigned the class action lawsuit against Langford and the East Dominion Energy Corporation. He didn't know that this case would make him a target. He didn't know that every skeleton in his past would be dragged into the light, that every ally would be questioned, and that the robe he wore, black, dignified, once a symbol of justice, would become a target for those who viewed the law as something to buy, bend, or bury. He only knew what he could see, a thick file folder resting on the edge of his desk. Case number F2831, Silver Grove v. Langford et al. Outside, the media circled like vultures. Reporters shouted questions through courthouse gates. Protesters flooded the steps, holding up scorched photos, burned insurance policies, and handmade signs with words like "blood for profit" and "justice can't be bought." Elias sat alone in courtroom 4. The lights above him dimmed. The room felt colder than usual, like the weight of history had decided to settle here and now. He reached for the file, opened it slowly. The first thing inside wasn't legal text or case law. It was a photo, a drone shot taken 2 days after the fire. Rows of houses turned to ash. Children sitting on sidewalk curbs, barefoot and blank-eyed. His fingers trembled, just for a second. The next page was a witness list, over 300 names. He scanned the first few. Maria Delgado, age 67, lost her home and husband. Levi Armstrong, 12, now blind in one eye from smoke inhalation. Tara Wilkins, 6 months pregnant, miscarried in the shelter days later. He closed the folder, his jaw clenched, his breath held. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't business as usual. This was war, waged not with bombs or bullets, but with silence, policy, and the slow grinding gears of institutional betrayal. He looked up at the bench before him, the same one he had presided from for 17 years. It had never felt so far away. Justice had always been an uphill battle, but this wasn't uphill. This was vertical, a wall built of power, wealth, and corruption, so thick it choked the truth before it could breathe. From outside the courtroom windows, the sound of chanting rose like a wave. "We want justice! We want justice!" Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply sat in that worn leather chair, staring at the mountain of files that represented lives burned to the ground. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the judge's bench. Not the man the public knew, not the composed figure of law and order, but a tired black man facing a tidal wave designed to drown him. And still he didn't look away. Behind him, in the shadows of courtroom 4, sat a stack of mail. Hundreds of letters from victims begging for help. Some typed, most handwritten, many tear-stained, all desperate. "Please, Your Honor," one read, "don't let him get away with it." He wouldn't. Elias Monroe was not a politician. He was not a celebrity. He had no army of consultants, no publicists, no donors. What he had was a belief, beaten into him from childhood, that the law meant something, that justice, real, painful, costly justice, was worth fighting for, even if it came at the price of everything else. But before Elias Monroe ever wore the robe of a federal judge, before his name commanded silence in courtrooms, there was a night that would shape his entire life. A night of injustice so raw, so personal, that it would carve itself into his bones forever. The screams didn't come first. What came first was the silence, thick, suffocating, unnatural. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around the bones and crushed the lungs. 10-year-old Elias Monroe sat on the faded blue couch, legs too short to touch the floor, his homework open in his lap, though he hadn't written a word in over an hour. His father, Samuel Monroe, stood in the kitchen, making coffee with that soft whistle he always did when he thought no one was listening. Outside, the sun had just dipped below the rooftops of their working-class neighborhood, casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. And then came the knock. Not a polite knock, not a neighbor's knock, a government knock. It rattled the entire apartment like thunder made of fists. His mother froze mid-step. His father stopped whistling. Elias felt the chill of something ancient run down his spine. The second knock came louder. By the third, the door burst open before anyone could answer. They didn't wait for permission. Men in dark vests and guns drawn spilled into the hallway like a SWAT-flavored flood. Barking orders, pointing fingers, grabbing wrists. "Samuel Monroe, on the ground, now!" his mother screamed. His father dropped the coffee pot, shattering it across the tile floor. Elias jumped to his feet, but a hand, gloved, rough, pushed him back down. "Stay there, kid." The voice was cold, robotic. Samuel didn't resist. He knelt, hands above his head, voice calm. "You've got the wrong person." But calm meant nothing. Truth meant nothing. Elias watched, wide-eyed and frozen, as zip ties replaced handcuffs, as knees dug into his father's back, as flashlights illuminated every crevice of their home like it was a crime scene. "What's happening?" Elias finally shouted. "Why are you taking him?" No one answered. One officer muttered, "Wire fraud, embezzlement, bribery." Words Elias didn't yet understand, but would never forget. Words that became curses in his nightmares. As they dragged his father away, Elias ran forward, clutching the leg of his dad's worn khakis. "He didn't do anything! He didn't do anything!" Samuel turned his head, his face bleeding from a gash above his eyebrow. "I love you, son," he whispered, and then he was gone. The door slammed behind them. The silence returned, but now it screamed. It took 7 months for the trial. Elias sat through every day of it. His mother wore her best dress, even when she couldn't afford to eat. They watched as prosecutors presented doctored spreadsheets and manipulated emails, all conveniently pulled from a company Samuel had never worked for. Witnesses were brought in, paid, rehearsed, and sharp. Every time Samuel opened his mouth, objections flew. Every time he tried to explain, the judge looked bored. It was over before it began. Guilty on all counts. Elias would never forget the moment the gavel dropped. It didn't sound like wood on wood. It sounded like a tomb sealing shut. Samuel Monroe was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. No parole, no mercy, no justice. They moved out of the apartment a month later. Couldn't afford rent, couldn't afford groceries. Elias stopped bringing lunch to school. Kids whispered behind his back, "Isn't his dad in jail?" Teachers looked at him like he might become the next one. He stopped smiling. He stopped speaking. But he started watching. Watching how judges spoke in courtrooms. Watching how attorneys twisted language like knives. Watching how the law, this thing he had once believed in, was a weapon aimed at the defenseless. And he made a promise. "I'll never let them do this to anyone else." Years passed. Elias buried himself in books, in codes, in statutes. While other kids were playing ball or chasing girls, he was reading the Constitution under a flickering streetlight. He graduated valedictorian, won scholarships no one thought he could earn, and walked into Harvard Law wearing a thrift store suit and a fire no storm could extinguish. But even as he rose, top of his class, editor of the Law Review, youngest clerk in the D.C. Circuit, he never forgot. The law he'd learned was not inherently just. It was merely a tool, a sword in the hand of whoever wielded it loudest. He saw classmates with trust funds and last names that opened doors like passwords. He saw judges play golf with CEOs they'd later rule in favor of. He saw prosecutors high-five each other after cutting deals that destroyed lives. He never high-fived. He never smiled after a ruling. He simply worked, quiet and relentless, sharpening his understanding of every loophole, every precedent, every line of fine print used to crush the voiceless. When he was appointed as a federal judge at 42, the youngest black judge in his district, some newspapers called it historic. Others called it suspicious. Diversity hire, one columnist wrote. Elias didn't respond. He just got to work. He ruled with iron logic, undeniable evidence, and a stare that turned lies into dust. His courtroom became known as the Last Wall, a place where no favor, no donation, no family name could tip the scales. But for all his rulings, for all his victories, one ghost never left him. His father. Samuel Monroe died in prison 7 months before Elias was appointed. Pneumonia. Poor treatment. They didn't even call in time for Elias to say goodbye. The system never apologized, never admitted wrong, never made it right. And that was the scar that never healed. Now, as Elias sat in his chambers, the Silver Grove case file on his desk, he knew exactly what this moment was. Not a trial, not a hearing, not even a reckoning. It was a return. The same machine that devoured his father had come again. Bigger, wealthier, meaner. And this time, it had new victims, new lies, new flames. But Elias wasn't 10 years old anymore, and he wasn't crying on the floor of a ransacked living room. He was the judge now, and they had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Elias had spent a lifetime preparing to fight injustice from the bench, but nothing could prepare him for the war unfolding in the Silver Grove case. Inside the courtroom, the Silver Grove class action trial had turned from a legal battle into a battlefield soaked in shadows. What was supposed to be a clear-cut case of corporate negligence had mutated into a labyrinth of smoke and mirrors. Each piece of evidence Elias Monroe touched felt like it had been dipped in acid, corroded, tampered with, fake. The engineering reports, forged. Not once, not by mistake, but systematically, surgically. Every inspection log showing years of failing infrastructure, replaced with pristine PDFs that claimed no critical issues found. Digital timestamps had been backdated, signatures replicated. The power company's internal servers had been wiped clean, then repopulated with pre-approved narratives. And the whistleblowers? Gone. One had moved out of state overnight, leaving behind an empty apartment and unpaid rent. Another recanted their entire statement in court, trembling as they spoke, eyes darting to the back of the room as if someone were waiting. A third, an intern who had emailed photos of corroded lines to local journalists, was found unconscious in a motel room. Official report, overdose. Elias had read the file. Something about it didn't sit right. Nothing did. Outside the courthouse, the war had shifted. Senator Patrick Langford, the man at the center of the corruption, was no longer just fighting for exoneration. He was fighting to bury Elias Monroe. Not through motions or legal arguments, through media. It started with whispers, then headlines. Judge Monroe's bias under fire. Can a man with a personal grudge deliver impartial justice? Critics question competence of youngest black federal judge. Langford's press machine had found its rhythm. Slick, ruthless, and well-funded. Overnight, Elias's background was dissected on talk shows. They pulled yearbook photos, misquoted law school lectures, twisted old speeches into radical rhetoric. One panelist on national TV declared, "This judge clearly has a chip on his shoulder. He's making this personal. We need a senior, experienced judge. not a diversity hire with an axe to grind. Another chimed in, when you give a case this big to someone who looks like he's still auditioning for a courtroom drama, what do you expect? The attacks were relentless. Anonymous letters arrived at the courthouse. One included a photo of Elias's childhood home with a red X over it. Protesters began gathering outside his chambers, holding signs that read, "Monroe equals agenda," and "We want justice, not revenge." Behind closed doors, defense attorneys began referring to him not as "Your Honor," but as the activist in robes. Still, Elias said nothing. He didn't rebut the media. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't threaten countersuits or demand apologies. Instead, he worked. He worked while the world tried to break him. It was past midnight when Elias sat alone in his office, the courthouse silent, the halls long emptied. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and thunder grumbled in the distance like the growl of something ancient. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow across pages, scattered like the wreckage of a storm. Deposition transcripts, motion filings, forensic reports, and hundreds of handwritten letters from Silver Grove victims begging the court not to forget them. In the center of it all sat the morning's newspaper. Front page, full-color photo, a picture of Elias at the bench, edited to look dark, grim, and out of place. The headline screamed, "Judge Monroe, too emotional to handle case." Below it, the article hinted at everything Langford had whispered behind closed doors, that Elias's father's wrongful conviction made him unfit, that his decisions were motivated by vengeance, not law. That justice had no room for bias, especially from a black man with baggage. Elias stared at the article for a long time. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just read every word, every accusation, every insinuation. Then, with a calmness colder than steel, he folded the paper once, twice, and slid it into a drawer. It made no sound, no anger, no comment, no defense, just silence. And then he picked up his pen. His hand moved with measured certainty, writing the opening lines of a draft that would become one of the most powerful judicial rulings in modern legal history. The words poured from a place deeper than memory, sharper than experience. They came from every injustice he'd witnessed, every lie the system had allowed, every child like him watching their parent dragged away without cause. Elias wasn't just writing a decision. He was writing a reckoning. He quoted statutes and legal precedents, yes, but he also quoted pain. He referenced ignored warnings, silenced experts, and faked reports. He dismantled the power company's narrative piece by piece, exposing the coordinated fraud like a surgeon peeling back skin to reveal rot beneath. Each line was a blade, each paragraph a torch, and still, even in the heat of his fury, he never let it consume the law. He stayed within its lines, tight, focused, ironclad. He left no room for appeal, no cracks for corruption to crawl back through. Behind him, the city slept. But Elias didn't. He couldn't. He knew what was at stake. He knew Langford wanted a mistrial, wanted him to snap, to scream, to walk into that courtroom and make it about race, revenge, or righteousness. But Elias would not give him that satisfaction. He would give him something worse, judgment. Outside the window, the rain slowed. The clouds began to break. Light, dim but pure, started to pierce the night sky. And inside courtroom 4, Judge Elias Monroe kept writing, his face calm, his eyes blazing, and the fire inside him refusing to die. Just as Elias began uncovering the cracks in Silver Grove's corporate facade, the full weight of retaliation came crashing down. Evidence vanished, witnesses went silent, and the fight for justice turned personal. Deadly personal. The walls were closing in, and Elias Monroe could feel it with every breath. What started as a case about negligence had turned into a crucible of power and fear. The deeper Elias pushed into the Silver Grove file, the more vicious the resistance became. It wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. It was sabotage. It was psychological warfare. It began with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. The line was silent at first, nothing but static. Elias had already been awake, hunched over his desk, red ink bleeding across pages of notes. Then finally a voice, low, mechanical, untraceable. "Stop digging. Or you won't be the only one who pays. Click. That same day, his wife Marie found a man sitting in a car across the street from their home. He wasn't holding a camera, but the message was clear. That night, when their son left basketball practice, he called Elias in a panic. "Dad, I think someone's following me." The threats weren't subtle anymore, and they weren't just coming for Elias. They were circling the people he loved. Meanwhile, one man still had the power to expose everything. Daniel Kerr, a former technician from East Dominion Power. Kerr had come forward quietly, handing off internal documents that proved the company had been warned repeatedly about faulty transformers and failing lines in Silver Grove. His testimony would blow the case wide open. He was scheduled to take the stand within a week, but 2 nights before his deposition, he disappeared. For 24 hours, no one could reach him. His phone went straight to voicemail. His email auto-replied with a family emergency message. Then, without warning, he resurfaced, standing at his front door with a bruised lip and shaking hands. He told reporters it had all been a misunderstanding. Elias knew better. Kerr had been silenced. Privately, Kerr admitted to Elias that his family had been followed, his daughter approached at school, his wife cornered in a grocery store parking lot. "They said if I testified," Kerr whispered, "we'd all disappear." He couldn't go through with it. Elias didn't blame him, but it didn't make the sting any less sharp. Then came the next strike, this time aimed squarely at Elias's credibility. An anonymous source leaked a series of documents to the media, emails, wire transfers, and photos that allegedly linked Elias to lobbying groups and private law firms. The narrative was explosive. Judge Monroe had accepted gifts, influence, and backdoor favors from legal coalitions connected to the plaintiffs. It was all fake, every last document. But the damage was instant. Headlines lit up. Conflict of interest? Monroe under fire for secret lobbyist ties. Scandal rocks, Silver Grove trial. Judge accused of backroom deals. TV pundits began to circle like sharks in bloodied water. One panel questioned whether Elias had compromised the integrity of the bench. Another outright called for a mistrial. The senator's PR machine didn't need to attack directly. They simply nudged the narrative and let public opinion do the rest. It worked. The community began to fracture. Outside the courthouse, protests were no longer unified. One side carried signs that read, "Stand with Monroe and truth over power." The other side, "Fake judge, bought and paid for. Impeach him now." And for the first time, Elias saw uncertainty in the eyes of the people who once believed in him. It cut deeper than any article ever could. He stopped sleeping. Nights became long, slow battles with doubt and silence. His desk became a war zone of legal texts and printouts. His coat never left the back of his chair. The shadows under his eyes deepened until they looked bruised. He drank coffee that had gone cold 3 hours earlier, wrote legal arguments until his pen ran dry, and still felt the walls tightening. He questioned everything. Was he doing the right thing? Was justice even possible when the machine was this well-oiled, this ruthless? He had stared down corrupt attorneys, biased juries, and political pressure before. But this was different. This was a slow suffocation. Every time he reached for the truth, another piece of it slipped through rigged systems, media spin, or manufactured doubt. And yet, he didn't stop. One night around 2 a.m., he received an envelope slipped under his chamber door. No return address. Inside, 2 photographs. One of his wife, Marie, locking the front door of their home. The other, his son, at the bus stop, headphones in, head down. The message was clear. His hands trembled as he set the photos down. He didn't speak, didn't shout. He just sat there staring into the dim light, his pulse thudding in his ears like distant gunfire. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a warning. Stop, or we break your world. But Elias had already lost too much to fear. He had lost his father to a system that bent to power. He had lost faith in comfort. And now, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant putting his entire life at risk, he would not let truth die quietly. So he returned to his desk. The draft ruling sat in front of him, half-written, filled with facts that had been fought for, clawed out of buried documents, salvaged from corrupted files. Every word he wrote was a shield for those who could no longer speak. Residents of Silver Grove, whistleblowers like Kerr, even himself. He didn't know if he would survive the fire that was coming, but he knew what he owed to the truth. He picked up his pen and kept writing. But they didn't just want him off the case. They wanted him erased. The petition came in the form of a crisp envelope, stamped with the seal of the Senate Judiciary Oversight Committee. But Elias Monroe didn't need to open it to know what it said. The signature on the cover page belonged to Senator Patrick Langford himself, the man whose empire of lies had turned Silver Grove into ash. And now, with his legal defenses cracking, Langford was playing his final card, a calculated attack on the one man standing between him and escape. The Honorable Elias Monroe, the petition read, demonstrates a pattern of personal bias, inflammatory rulings, and possible conflicts of interest that compromise his ability to preside over the Silver Grove proceedings with the impartiality required of a federal judge. It was a lie, every word, but it didn't matter. Within 24 hours, the Judicial Review Committee voted to temporarily suspend Elias Monroe, pending a full investigation into his conduct. No ruling, no defense, just silence. His courtroom was locked, his nameplate removed. The gavel he had wielded in pursuit of justice now sat cold and untouched in a sealed chamber. For the first time in over a decade, Elias didn't walk into the courthouse at dawn. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk in front of it, watching as security guards posted a temporarily closed sign across the courthouse doors. The halls where he once demanded truth had fallen mute, drowned out by bureaucracy, fear, and political power. The message was clear: back down, disappear, or be destroyed. Inside his chest, something twisted and burned. Not anger, not sorrow, but something heavier. The weight of betrayal, the sense of justice slipping further from reach. But Silver Grove hadn't forgotten him. That night, long after dusk fell and the news anchors gleefully dissected his suspension, something unexpected stirred outside Elias's home. First it was one family, then 3, then 10. They came quietly, carrying candles and flashlights, some with homemade signs, others with tears in their eyes. There were mothers holding photos of their burned homes, elderly couples wrapped in blankets, their retirement savings gone in the fire, teenagers clutching posters that read, "We still believe in Judge Monroe." Soon the sidewalk outside his modest house glowed in flickering candlelight. No chants, no microphones, just silent defiance. A vigil for the judge they trusted. A protest against the system trying to silence him. Elias watched from behind the curtain at first, stunned. In a world so quick to turn away, these people had come not to ask, but to stand. And among them was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with soot-stained sneakers and eyes too old for his age. Elias remembered him, not his name, but his face, from the first week of the trial. He'd testified about how his bedroom had caught fire while he was drawing pictures of astronauts. His voice had cracked when he said, "I couldn't save my toy." Now the boy stood in front of Elias's gate, holding something small and crumpled in his hands. His mother gave him a gentle nudge. Elias stepped outside. The crowd fell silent. The boy walked up slowly and extended his hand. It was the charred remains of a stuffed bear. Its fur was singed black. One eye had melted, but it had been stitched back together, clumsily with thick white thread. "This was my favorite," the boy said, looking up. "It almost didn't make it, but I fixed it, 'cause I believe it still matters." Elias swallowed hard. The boy pressed the bear into his hand. "You're like this bear, I think, burned a little, but not broken. I know you'll do what's right." It took everything Elias had not to break down. He nodded once, his jaw clenched too tight for words. The boy smiled and turned back toward the crowd. Elias stood there, the weight of the scorched bear in his hand, heavier than any gavel he had ever lifted. Back inside, the silence felt different now. Not hollow, but loaded. Waiting. He walked into his study and sat at the desk, where just days ago he had been finalizing the draft of his ruling, a ruling he had never been allowed to issue. His laptop was still open, the screen dark from inactivity. Next to it, the framed photo of his wife and son stared back at him. And beyond that, his gavel. He reached for it, ran his fingers along the polished wood. This wasn't over. They had taken his courtroom. They had smeared his name. They had twisted public opinion and tried to blackmail him into silence. But they had made one mistake. They thought justice only lived in buildings. They thought Elias Monroe was a title, not a fire that refused to die. He stood again, this time not as a judge, not even as a man under investigation, but as a symbol of what couldn't be bought, silenced, or buried. And in his heart, something reignited. It wasn't vengeance, it was purpose. Because somewhere out there, children like that boy still believed the system could work, still believed men like Elias Monroe could protect them. And he couldn't let that belief burn with everything else. He picked up the bear, set it beside the gavel, and whispered, "I'm not done. Not even close. The fight for justice is just beginning." More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The courtroom was closed, the title stripped, the gavel silenced. But Elias Monroe had never been more dangerous. Suspension didn't stop him. It freed him. They had pushed him outside the system, thinking he would disappear. But in the shadows, without protocols to bind his hands, Elias became something else, a quiet reckoning. By day, he stayed indoors, a ghost judge in a quiet house, the media cycle spinning lies and rumors just outside his door. But by night, he made calls, secure lines, encrypted apps, meetings in cars parked beneath overpasses. He wasn't reaching for the law anymore. He was reaching for the truth, no matter how far it had been buried. And the first person to believe in him, not because she had to, but because she saw what others refused to, was a young reporter named Kara Lynn. She wasn't from any major network. She wasn't rich, connected, or protected. But she had something far more dangerous: integrity. She had covered the Silver Grove fires early on, before the spin, before the consultants, before Langford's team flooded the headlines. Elias had noticed her in the crowd outside his home during the candlelight vigil. She hadn't held a sign. She'd held a camera and a notepad, and eyes that didn't look away when the truth got ugly. Kara met Elias in a parking garage at 2 a.m. She wore a hoodie. He wore a baseball cap. It wasn't just precaution. It was survival. "I need access, she said. "Internal emails, transfers, anything they're hiding." "They're hiding everything," Elias replied. And then he handed her the first breadcrumb, a series of redacted contracts between the State Utilities Commission and East Dominion Energy, dated 6 months before the Silver Grove fires. It wasn't much, but the language was vague, the dates suspicious, and the signatures matched Langford's inner circle. That was enough for Kara. For the next 2 weeks, while the world believed Elias Monroe had gone silent, he and Kara moved through the city like insurgents, part judge, part journalist, full rebellion. They traced a trail of money, one Langford had worked very hard to cover up. It began with campaign donations, bland, public, and unassuming. But from there, it twisted into shell corporations, real estate deals, and phony consulting contracts. Money laundering 101, if the stakes weren't so high. Elias mapped every account. Kara chased every name. One by one, the threads started to tangle, and they led to one place: Langford's personal holding company in the Caymans. It wasn't just corruption, it was deliberate. And then came the smoking gun. A whistleblower from inside East Dominion, terrified, anonymous, but fed up, sent Kara an encrypted file. She decrypted it in Elias's kitchen while he paced behind her. It was an internal company email, sent 2 weeks before the fires, between top-level executives and government liaisons. Subject: Projections and land value opportunities, Silver Grove sector. Body: Once the fires clear the way, the parcels drop in price. We move fast. Let the flames make room for investment. The room fell silent. Elias stopped pacing. The words echoed in the air like a gunshot. Let the flames make room for investment. They hadn't just ignored the warnings. They had welcomed the destruction. They had planned for it, counted on it, profited from it. Elias sat down, eyes fixed on the screen. His hands didn't shake. Not this time. "I need to file a motion," he said quietly. "A federal counter petition." The document took him 3 sleepless nights to prepare. It wasn't just a plea to return to the bench. It was a legal counterstrike, a detailed breakdown of evidence, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and judicial sabotage. It included timelines, names, figures, and direct quotes. It argued not only for his reinstatement, but also for emergency injunctive relief to freeze East Dominion's assets and launch a federal inquiry into Langford's financial relationships. Elias Monroe wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was forcing the system to confront itself. He sent the motion at exactly 5:04 a.m., the timestamp matching the hour the first fire had been reported in Silver Grove. Then he waited. The media didn't cover it immediately. Langford's team tried to downplay it, called it a desperate act from a disgraced judge. But by then, Kara had already leaked the internal email to 3 independent outlets. The headline hit before noon. Judge suspended in Silver Grove case, uncovers shocking corporate plot behind fires. The internet ignited. Langford's PR team scrambled. East Dominion issued a statement calling the email inauthentic. But then a second whistleblower confirmed it. Then a third. Then a fire analyst stepped forward with proof that power infrastructure had been intentionally overloaded. Within hours, public sentiment shifted like a storm. The same people who once doubted Elias now demanded his return. Kara's story reached 1 million views in a day. Someone spray-painted "Bring Back Monroe" across the courthouse wall. And for the first time since his suspension, Elias stepped outside his home without fear. Not as a victim, as a threat, but he wasn't done. He knew Langford would fight back. There would be more smears, more threats, more attempts to twist the narrative. But the difference now was momentum. Elias didn't just have truth on his side, he had the people. Inside the sealed courthouse, the gavel still waited. And this time, Elias wasn't just coming to finish the case. He was coming to burn the whole corrupt house down. The storm didn't break quietly. It exploded on live television. In a special midnight broadcast aired across national networks and streamed by millions online, Carolyn sat beneath bright studio lights with a folder in her lap and fury in her voice. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't hearsay. It was war. In the past 2 months, she began, her tone sharp as steel, the people of Silver Grove have been told that their suffering was a natural disaster, unforeseeable, unpreventable. Tonight, we proved that was a lie. The screen behind her came alive. Slide 1, a falsified safety inspection form, dated 3 weeks before the fires, bearing the forged signature of a state inspector who had died 6 months earlier. Slide 2, internal infrastructure maps, marked confidential, revealing the true state of Silver Grove's power grid. Decades out of code, rusted to the bone, with high-risk warnings that had been digitally removed in the publicly released versions. Slide 3, a payment ledger showing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled from East Dominion's Community Support Initiative into political action committees aligned with Senator Patrick Langford, including one that paid for his luxury vacation just 10 days before the first spark. Kara paused. Her eyes burned. These weren't mistakes. They were strategies. The infrastructure wasn't neglected. It was sacrificed. And the people of Silver Grove weren't victims of fate. They were targets of profit. The line hit like a hammer. Phones buzzed across the nation. Hashtags surged. News anchors scrambled to reframe their previous narratives. The court of public opinion had just turned on its heel. But in Silver Grove, it turned into something more than noise. It became fire. By morning, the streets outside the state capitol building were flooded. People came by the thousands. Mothers holding scorched photographs. Grandfathers wearing oxygen masks. Teenagers with signs reading, "We remember the flames. Now you'll remember us." A single teddy bear, charred and stitched together, was placed on the building steps. Then another. Then 50. The toys lined the marble staircase like a silent cemetery of innocents lost. They chanted Elias Monroe's name. They shouted for Langford's arrest. They demanded accountability, not from a faceless system, but from the men who had watched their homes burn and smiled. For the first time since the smoke cleared, Silver Grove wasn't grieving. It was rising, and the system had no choice but to notice. The order came at 11:17 a.m., stamped and sealed from the Federal Court of Appeals. Elias Monroe was to be reinstated, temporarily, conditionally, to preside over the completion of the Silver Grove case. It wasn't a victory, it was a door. But Elias walked through it. He returned to the courthouse alone, coat flapping in the morning wind, walking past protesters, reporters, and federal agents. No motorcade, no entourage, just a man with a gavel and a mission. The courtroom doors creaked open like the gates of a tomb. Dust still lingered in the air. The overhead lights flickered on slowly, illuminating the bench that had been vacant for weeks. He stepped up to it like a warrior reclaiming his sword. And there it was, his gavel, polished, untouched, waiting. He sat, straightened his spine, and slammed it down. This court is back in session. Judge Elias Monroe sat high behind the bench, face carved from stone, black robes draped like armor across his shoulders. The gavel rested before him, untouched. He hadn't needed to use it. The room was already holding its breath. This wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about truth, raw, unfiltered, unforgiving. The prosecution had rested. The defense had squirmed. But now Elias did what no one expected. He opened the floor to the victims. One by one, they rose. One by one, they spoke. And with each testimony, another layer of Langford's polished facade cracked. The first was a school teacher, gray hair, shaky hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "We smelled the smoke during a math lesson," she said, staring into the middle distance. "I told the children it was nothing. Just a field fire," I said. "Stay calm." But then the windows melted. She stopped, took a breath. "There were 23 kids in my classroom. We got out, but my classroom didn't. Neither did their drawings, their books, their sense of safety." She turned toward the defense table. "He didn't just burn down a building. He burned their belief that the world would protect them." Langford didn't flinch, but the jury did. Next came an older man, wrinkled face, veteran's cap pulled low. He leaned on a cane, but his voice didn't waver. "I served 2 tours. Never cried a day in my life," he said. "But I cried when I found my wife's wedding dress in ashes." He stared at Langford. "Not because of the fire. Fires happen. But because it could have been stopped, and you let it burn." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elias didn't silence it. Some moments deserved to echo. A mother took the stand next. She carried a photograph of her son, 10 years old, smiling, 2 front teeth missing. "We were at the pharmacy when the flames reached our street," she said. "By the time we got back, it was gone. His room, his toys, his inhaler, all gone." She looked straight at Langford, her hands trembling. "My son died 2 weeks later. Smoke damage. Complications." Then softly, "He didn't die in the fire. He died in the aftermath. You didn't just burn our homes. You burned our future." Elias closed his eyes just for a moment. He didn't break, but he bled inside. And then came the line. The courtroom had already sunk into silence, deep, aching, charged. But it wasn't ready for what came next. A teenage girl took the stand. No lawyer prepped her, no speech written. She simply looked around the courtroom, then at Langford and said, "He didn't burn our houses. He burned our neighborhood, our school, our library, our memories." She paused. Then her voice hardened into steel. "He didn't just burn our past. He lit a match to our future." The courtroom froze. Even the reporters stopped typing. Langford's jaw twitched. It was the only thing that moved in the room. From his bench, Elias watched it all. Not as a judge, but as a man who knew what injustice looked like from the inside. He remembered the night his father was dragged away in cuffs, remembered how the system had looked away. Now it was looking right at Langford, and it was not blinking. Langford's defense team tried to object. "Your Honor, this is prejudicial." "Overruled," Elias said, voice flat and final. "Let the people speak." They tried to stall, redirect, interrupt. Elias let none of it through. He gave the victims the floor, and they took it with fire in their throats. A local firefighter testified next. "I filed 3 reports about faulty transformers. They were ignored." By whom? By corporate liaisons, by Langford's appointees. Every warning was buried. "Did you feel pressure to stay quiet?" He laughed, cold, bitter. I was told if I said one more word, I'd be reassigned to a desk until retirement. He looked at Elias. Your Honor, I didn't want to be a hero. I just didn't want to watch people burn. But they made me watch anyway. The courtroom was a powder keg, and Senator Patrick Langford lit the match. He rose from his seat with a sharp jerk, eyes wild, face flushed red with rage and panic. The tie that had once hung with calculated precision now dangled loose like the unraveling of a carefully controlled image. The gallery fell into stunned silence as he leaned forward, pointing a trembling finger at Judge Elias Monroe. You think you've won? He spat, his voice cracking with fury. You fools have no idea what you're playing with. I built this town. I built this state. Without me, you'd still be living in ashen tents. The room tensed. Bailiffs took cautious steps toward him, hands near their belts. Langford wasn't done. He turned to the gallery, eyes sweeping across the crowd like a wildfire. You'll regret this, he hissed. All of you. You'll crawl back to me. You'll beg. And when you do, when everything collapses, don't expect mercy. Then with venom so thick it made the walls seem colder, he turned back to Elias. And you, he growled, you're nothing but a token in a robe, a pawn dressed like a king. They put you up there so they could feel better about tearing me down. Gas shot through the gallery. Carolyn's hands flew to her keyboard. Reporters scrambled for cameras. The courtroom wasn't just watching history, they were inside it. But Elias Monroe didn't flinch. He sat still for a moment, absorbing every hateful syllable like a man watching a fire burn itself out. Then he stood slowly, deliberately, his presence commanding the room with nothing but silence and steady breath. Senator Langford, Elias said, voice low, voice cold. You have just committed contempt of court. Langford sneered. You can't. I can, Elias snapped, louder now, sharper. And I will. He raised his gavel. Bailiff, take him into custody. The gavel slammed down with the force of a thunderclap. The room erupted. Langford lunged as the bailiffs moved in, but they were faster. His wrists were grabbed, twisted, cuffed. He shouted, screamed, threatened. But it all dissolved under the cold click of steel locking around his arms. Don't touch me. I am a United States Senator. Elias stepped forward from the bench, descending like a judge from Olympus. And that title, he said, eyes burning, does not place you above the law. In fact, it makes your betrayal of it even more damning. Langford thrashed. This is a setup. I'll sue you. I'll bury you. But the courtroom didn't listen anymore, because the moment the senator's feet left the ground and he was dragged toward the holding chamber, the curtain of power fell, and behind it, just a man, corrupt, cornered, crumbling. The next hour unfolded like a storm breaking apart in slow motion. Elias called for a full evidentiary review in open court. Everything was laid bare. The fake inspection records, traced back to Langford's chief of staff, who had flipped the night before in a sealed deposition. The offshore accounts, cross-referenced with contractor kickbacks, each payment leading straight to Langford's re-election campaign fund. The whistleblower's testimony, corroborated by internal East Dominion Energy emails, including one damning message that read, "The fires will clear the market. The senator will handle the rest." And then came the final blow. A forensic tech from the Federal Cybercrimes Division took the stand and confirmed, under oath, that evidence presented by Langford's legal team had been digitally altered, timestamps erased, signatures forged, metadata tampered with. Langford's legal team collapsed like dominoes. The court fell into a stunned silence as Elias picked up the final ruling. He read it slowly with surgical precision, each word a blade. This court finds Senator Patrick Langford guilty of obstruction of justice, contempt of court, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal negligence resulting in mass endangerment. He looked directly at Langford, now seated in shackles, eyes glassy, breathing shallow. For your actions, this court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison. No fanfare, no applause, just the hammering silence of accountability landing hard on power's back. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had already begun to gather again. News of the ruling spread like wildfire, this time not one that destroyed, but one that cleansed. People cried, not out of pain, but out of relief. A group of survivors held hands beneath the courthouse steps. One woman clutched a copy of her denied insurance claim, now finally about to be honored. And in the center of the crowd, a boy stood quietly with a burned teddy bear in his hands. His eyes locked with Elias's as the judge stepped through the doors. And slowly the boy raised the bear high, like a gavel of his own. Elias didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just nodded, once. Because this wasn't the end of the story. This was the turning point. For years, power had buried the truth beneath smoke, ash, and paperwork. But now the smoke had cleared, and the truth was standing tall, in a black robe with fire in his eyes and justice in his hands. Elias Monroe stepped down from the bench with the slow, deliberate movement of a man carrying the weight of generations on his shoulders. The gavel no longer in his hand, the robe still heavy on his back, he paused just before the final step, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. Once a battleground, now a monument. And that's when it happened. Not a cheer, not a shout, but silence, thick, breathless, holy silence, as every person in the gallery began to rise. One row, then another, then all of them. Men, women, children, survivors with scars, not just on skin, but in memory. Lawyers, reporters, clerks, the janitor with the limp, the single mother who lost everything, the boy with the burned teddy bear. Every last one of them stood, not in protest, not in grief, but in reverence. And then came the sound, not thunder, not noise, but a slow, rising wave of applause that hit like a heartbeat. Clap, 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 until the room was trembling under the rhythm of justice being honored. It was not the applause of celebration, it was the applause of survival. The courtroom had seen fire, literally and figuratively. It had seen lies, manipulation, intimidation. It had seen a man stripped of dignity, painted as biased, attacked for the color of his skin, the strength of his convictions, the clarity of his morality. And that man had not broken. Not when they dragged his name through headlines. Not when they threatened his family. Not when he sat alone at 3 a.m. reading fabricated accusations. Not when every hallway echoed with whispers. Not when the system he served told him to sit down, shut up, and let it go. He didn't. And now the people, his people, were standing. Elias's eyes landed on Caroline, the young reporter who had believed in him when even the law hadn't. Tears clung to her lashes, her notebook forgotten at her side. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He looked past her to the front row. There sat Sarah Jameson, holding her daughter in one arm and the scorched remains of her home's welcome sign in the other. Her eyes locked with Elias's, and she mouthed, "You gave us back our voice." In the corner, little Isaiah raised his teddy bear again, its one glass eye catching the light like a diamond. And that was when Elias finally exhaled. Not in victory, but in release. He stepped down the final step. The marble echoed beneath his feet. The applause grew louder, but he didn't acknowledge it with a wave or a smile. Instead, he walked straight toward the door. Not to escape, but to re-enter the world he had risked everything to change. Outside, the streets of Silver Grove were overflowing. The news had spread like a lightning strike. Langford sentenced. The empire collapsed. The truth revealed. Justice delivered. Not cleanly, not easily, but undeniably. Candles flickered along the courthouse steps. Signs lifted into the sky like prayer flags. Justice isn't bought here. Elias stood. So do we. Truth never burns. People didn't cheer for vengeance. They didn't dance for blood. They stood shoulder to shoulder for something far more rare: accountability. As Elias exited through the courthouse doors, the crowd parted like a sea. No barriers, no security, just people. One by one, they reached out, not to shake his hand, but simply to touch his sleeve, his arm, the edge of his robe, as if to say, "We remember. We see you. We won't forget." He kept walking, not because he wanted to leave, but because he knew something more important than justice had been planted here. Legacy. That night, Elias sat alone in his office, the robe folded neatly beside him, the gavel resting in its cradle. The lamp glowed soft and gold against the polished wood. In front of him lay the final document, a letter of thanks from the federal judiciary, a formal acknowledgement of the case's completion, a paragraph praising his integrity, his perseverance, his courage. But he didn't read it. His eyes drifted instead to the shelf where Isaiah's teddy bear now sat, its singed fur forever a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. The clock ticked. Outside, Silver Grove slept soundly for the first time in months, and inside, Elias whispered the only words he could manage. We didn't fix the system, but we proved it can't break everyone. He leaned back in the chair. Let the silence wrap around him. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of suppression, but the silence that follows when a war ends and the earth waits to grow something new. He had fought not just for justice, but to remind the world that even the most corrupted courtroom can still echo with truth when someone refuses to stay silent. And in that truth, Elias Monroe had found something greater than victory. He had found meaning, and meaning that lasts longer than fire, that cannot be stolen, that cannot be buried. It lives in the ashes, in the verdict, and in the hearts of the people who now knew. One man standing tall was enough to bring the empire to its knees. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The air in Silver Grove carried a different kind of weight now. Not smoke, not ash, but breath, clean, steady, filled with life and rebuilding. The sun spilled across streets that had once been lined with cinders. Hammers now echoed where silence once hung like a noose. And as Elias Monroe walked down Main Street, his shoes tapping on freshly paved concrete, he didn't see destruction anymore. He saw resurrection. The town was rising, home by home, brick by brick, frame by frame. Children played again, their laughter bouncing off half-built walls like an anthem. Shop fronts that had been blackened by fire now shimmered with fresh paint. Elias passed a bakery where the smell of rising dough drifted into the air. Where once there had been sirens, now there was cinnamon. But then came the moment that stopped him cold. A little girl, maybe 7, no older, stepped out from behind her mother's legs. Her dress was too big for her frame, her hands dirt-streaked from playing near a construction site. But her eyes, those eyes held galaxies of pain and wonder. She walked up to Elias slowly and held out something tiny, a beaded bracelet, handmade with melted plastic charms and mismatched colors. This is for you, she whispered, her voice small but unshaking. I'm not scared of fire anymore, because you didn't let it win. Elias bent to one knee, hands trembling as he accepted the gift. He looked at her, not as a judge, not as a symbol, but as a man who had once been a child just like her, who had watched the system crush someone he loved and had vowed never to let it happen again. Thank you, he said softly, and as she smiled, he felt something shift inside him. Not release, not relief, but resolve. Because fire doesn't just destroy. Sometimes it forges. That evening, Carolyn stood before a national audience, her hands trembling only slightly as she accepted the National Investigative Journalism Award. Cameras flashed, screens glowed. Her story, the fire behind the silence, had swept the nation like a moral reckoning. Her reporting had torn the veil from systemic corruption. It had exposed the backdoor dealings between power and policy, had revealed how an entire community had been sacrificed on the altar of profit. Her name was now etched alongside those who had once brought down empires with nothing but truth and grit. But when she spoke, she didn't gloat. I didn't win this for writing the truth, she said. I won because someone else had the courage to stand in it. Judge Elias Monroe didn't just fight the system, he fought the silence we're all told to accept. And because of him, Silver Grove didn't just survive, it changed the country. The crowd erupted in applause. And watching from the back row, Elias didn't clap. He simply nodded once. Because validation doesn't always come in awards. Sometimes it comes in knowing the world finally heard what it tried so hard to ignore. Weeks later, Elias stood behind a podium at a legal ethics conference in Washington, D.C. The room was packed. Judges, clerks, law students, skeptics, believers. Cameras rolled, pens hovered, anticipation thickened. But when he spoke, he didn't speak like a judge. He spoke like a man who had lost something sacred and fought tooth and nail to get it back. "I want you to understand something," Elias said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room like a blade. "I didn't win because I'm strong. I didn't win because I'm smart. I didn't win because I had the law on my side. There were days the law was the first thing trying to break me." He paused. Let the silence soak in. "I won because I refused to be silent. That's it. That's all. I lost sleep. I lost friends. I lost safety. But I kept my voice. And in a world built on power, that was enough to bring it to its knees." He stepped back from the microphone, the room frozen, no one breathing. Then, just like in the courtroom, they stood. Row after row, legal scholars, lawmakers, activists, survivors. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a gavel. Sometimes it just needs someone who refuses to shut up. As the night fell over Washington, Elias returned to his modest hotel room and placed the beaded bracelet on the desk beside his laptop. He stared at it for a long moment, not because it was pretty, but because it had weight, the weight of what had almost been lost. The truth, a town, a child's belief in good, all nearly gone, all now preserved. And yet he knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere in another town, another boardroom, another courtroom, another Silver Grove was waiting, waiting for someone to speak, waiting for someone to burn without turning to ash, waiting for another Elias Monroe. But for tonight, in this room, with the hum of traffic outside and the silence of justice finally settling in his bones, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Not in exhaustion, but in peace, because the fire had come, and the fire had passed, and what remained was him, whole, unbroken, true, and that was enough. The courthouse was new, marble floors that hadn't yet been scuffed by years of footsteps, walls that still smelled faintly of paint and quiet promise. But for Elias Monroe, as he stepped across the threshold of the newly built courtroom, it wasn't the shine of the room that mattered. It was what it stood for. Reclamation. The old room, the one that had once echoed with lies, with threats, with whispered slurs about his skin and his integrity, was gone, burned down with the rest of the rot. And in its place stood this, a chamber born from ash, built by a town that refused to die. He walked slowly toward the bench, not with pomp, not with pride, but with purpose. In his hand he carried no gavel, just a small charred object wrapped in cloth. He reached the judge's desk, paused, and then, with the care of a man placing a relic on an altar, he unwrapped the burned teddy bear. Its fur was half melted, its eye missing, its limbs stiff from smoke damage. But it stood, crooked, scarred, and still standing. Just like the town, just like Elias himself. He placed it on the bench beside his seat, right where it would remain, a reminder that justice was never about power, never about headlines, never about winning. It was about this bear, about the child who gave it to him with trembling hands and whispered, "I'm not afraid of fire anymore. Because of you." Elias sat down slowly. The leather of the chair creaked. Like it too, was taking a deep breath. His fingers brushed the bear one more time, not out of sentiment, but out of vow. Never forget why you began. Outside, the courthouse stood surrounded by a town reborn. But inside, in this sacred space, Elias Monroe took his place once more, not just as a judge, but as a keeper of the fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that forges. The kind that burns corruption to the ground so that truth can rise. This may be where Elias's story settles. But across the world, there are still voices being silenced, families losing everything, and powers that think they're too big to be held accountable. That's why these stories matter. That's why you matter. If Elias Monroe's journey moved you, if you felt the fire in his fight and the truth in his silence, Don't let this be the last courtroom you walk into. Hit like to stand with those who refuse to stay silent. Click subscribe to follow more stories that speak truth to power. And share this story, because somewhere out there, someone is still fighting to be heard. Justice begins with truth, and truth begins when someone refuses to look away.